Hey, Miss Vexing. Getting ready to read chapter 2 here in about 7 minutes. Just 2 more minutes. We'll see if anybody else wants to join. See if you're even here. Says 0 in here. Yeah, I can see you now. It wasn't showing you before. It showed 0. Now it shows 1. Can you hear me? Yeah, I'm going to hook him up to it after it's over and go back and play it. I'm already got the dog settled down and everything, and I don't want to get back up because if I do, then they'll start barking and going nuts. And I'm ready to start reading this chapter right now. So let's get started. Hold on just a minute. I got to find my Kindle on here. Okay, now I'm on my. Wait a minute. Okay, that should work. Can you hear me okay now? I am on my iPad. Okay, good, good, good. All right, let's go for it. Oops. All right, unplug the damn thing. All right, we're ready. Chapter 2. You realize that chapter 1 we just came through and, the airplane incident. So, chapter 2, Cameron Williams had roused when the old woman directly in front of him called out to the pilot. The pilot had shushed her, causing her to speak back at Buck. To peek back at Buck, he dragged his fingers through his longish blonde hair and forced a groggy smile. Trouble, ma'am? It's my Harold, she said. Buck had helped the old man put his herringbone wool jacket and felt hat in the overhead bin when they boarded. Harold was a short, dapper gentleman in penny loafers, brown slacks, and a tan sweater vest over a shirt and tie. He was balding, and Buck assumed he would want the hat again later when the air conditioning kicked in. Does he need something? He's gone. I'm sorry. He's disappeared. Well, I'm sure he slipped off to the washroom while you were sleeping. Would you mind checking for me? And take a blanket. Ma'am, I'm afraid he's gone off naked. He's a religious person and he'll be terribly embarrassed. Buck suppressed a smile when he noticed the woman's pained expression. He climbed over the sleeping executive on the aisle, who had far exceeded his limit of free drinks, and leaned in to take a blanket from the old woman. Indeed, Harold's clothes were in a neat pile on his seat, his glasses and hearing aid on top. The pant leg still hung over the edge and led to his shoes and socks. Bizarre, Buck thought. Why so fastidious? He remembered a friend in high school who had a form of epilepsy that occasionally caused him to black out when he seemed perfectly conscious. He might remove his shoes and socks in public or come out of a washroom with his clothes open. Does your husband have a history of epilepsy? No. Sleepwalking? No. I'll be right back. The first class labs were unoccupied, but as Buck headed for the stairs, he found several other passengers in the aisle. Excuse me, he said, I'm looking for someone. Well, who isn't? A woman said. So Buck pushed his way past several people and found lines to the washrooms in busy business and economy. The pilot brushed past him without a word, and Buck was soon met by the senior flight attendant. Sir, I need to ask you to return to your seat and fasten your belt. I'm looking for, everybody is looking for someone, she said. We hope to have some information for you in a few minutes. Now, please. She steered him back toward the stairs, then slipped past him and took the steps two at a time. Halfway up the stairs, Buck turned and surveyed the scene. It was the middle of the night, for heaven's sake, and as the cabin lights came on, he shuddered. All over the plane, people were holding up clothes and gasping or shrieking that someone was missing. Coffee. Somehow he knew this was no dream, and he felt the same terror he had endured awaiting his death in Israel. What was he going to tell Harold's wife? You're not the only one? Lots of people left their clothes in their seats? As he hurried back to his seat, his mind searched its memory banks for anything he had ever read, seen, or heard of any technology that could remove people from their clothes and make them disappear from a decidedly secure environment. Whoever did this? Were they on the plane? Would they make demands? Would another wave of disappearances be next? Would he become a victim? Where would he find himself? Fear seemed to pervade the cabin as he climbed over his sleeping seatmate again. He stood and leaned over the back of the chair ahead of him. Apparently, many people are missing, he told the old woman. She looked as puzzled and fearful as Buck himself felt. He sat down as the intercom came on and the captain addressed the passengers. After instructing them to return to their assigned seats, the captain explained, I'm going to ask the flight attendants to check the lavatories and be sure everybody is accounted for. Then I'll ask them to pass out foreign entry cards. If anyone in your party is missing, I would like you to fill out the card in his or her name and list every shred of detail you can think of from date of birth to description. I'm sure you all realize that we have a very troubling situation. The cards will give us a count of those missing, and I'll have something to give authorities. My first officer, Mr. Smith, will now make a accuracy count of empty seats. I will try to contact Pan Continental. I must tell you, however, that our location makes it extremely difficult to communicate with the ground without long delays. I will try to raise them on the satellite phone. As soon as I know anything, I'll convey it to you. In the meantime, I appreciate your cooperation and calm. Buck watched as the first officer came rushing from the cockpit, hatless and flushed. He hurried down one aisle and up the other, eyes darting from seat to seat as the flight attendant passed out cards. Buck's seatmate roused, drooling when an attendant asked if anyone in his party was missing. Missing? No. And there's nobody in this party but me. He curled up again and went back to sleep, unaware. The first officer had been gone only a few minutes when Rayford heard his key in the cockpit door and it banged open. Christopher flopped into his chair, ignored the seatbelt, and sat with his head in his hands. What's going on, Ray? He said. We got us more than 100 people gone with nothing but their clothes left behind. That many? Yeah, like it'd be better if it was only 50. How the heck are we going to explain landing with less passengers than we took off with? Well, Rayford shook his head, still working the radio, trying to reach someone, anyone, in Greenland or an island in the middle of nowhere. But they were too remote even to pick up a radio station for news. Finally, he connected with a Concorde, several miles away, heading the other direction. He nodded to Christopher to put on his own earphones. You got enough fuel to get back to the States? Over, the pilot asked Rayford. He looked at Christopher, who nodded and whispered, We're halfway. I could make Kennedy, Rayford said. Forget it, came the reply. Nothing's landing in New York. Two runways still open in Chicago. That's where we're going. We came from Chicago. Can't I put down at Heathrow? Negative, closed. Paris? Man, you've got to get back where you came from. We left Paris an hour ago, got the word, what's happening, and we're told to go straight to Chicago. What's happening? Concorde? If you don't know, why'd you put out the Mayday? I've got a situation here I don't even want to talk about. Hey, friend, it's all over the world, you know. Negative, I don't know, Rayford said. Talk to me. You're missing passengers, right? Roger, more than 100. Whoa, we lost nearly 50. What do you make of it, Concorde? First thing I thought of was spontaneous combustion. But there would have been smoke, residue. There's people materially disappeared. Only thing I can compare it to is the old Star Trek shows where people got dematerialized and rematerialized, beamed all over the place. I sure wish I could tell my people their loved ones were going to reappear just as quickly and completely as they disappeared, Rayford said. That's not the worst of it. Pan heavy. People everywhere have disappeared. Orly lost air traffic controllers and ground controllers. Some planes have lost flight crews. Where it's daylight, there are car pileups, chaos everywhere, planes down all over, at every major airport. So this was a spontaneous thing? Everywhere at once, just a little under an hour ago. I was almost hoping it was something on this plane. Some gas, some malfunction. That it was selective, you mean, over. Rayford caught the sarcasm. I see what you mean, Concorde. Gotta admit, this is somewhere we've never been before, and never want to be again. I keep telling myself, it's a bad dream, a nightmare, over. Roger, but it's not, is it? What are you going to tell your passengers, Concorde? No clue. You, over. The truth. Can't hurt now, but what's the truth? What do we know? Not a blessed thing. Good choice of words, Pan Heavy. You know what some people are saying, over? Roger, Rayford said. Better it's people gone to heaven than some world power doing this with fancy rays. Word we get is that every country has been affected. See you in Chicago, Roger. Rayford still looked at Christopher, who began changing the settings to turn the monstrous wide body around and get it headed back toward the States. Ladies and gentlemen, Rayford said over the intercom, we're not going to be able to land in Europe. We're headed back to Chicago. We're almost exactly halfway to our original destination, so we will not have a fuel problem. I hope this puts your minds at ease somewhat. I will let you know when we are close enough to begin using your cell phones. Until I do, you will do yourself a favor by not trying. When the captain had come back on the intercom with the information about returning to the United States, Buck Williams was surprised to hear applause throughout the cabin. Shocked and terrified as everyone was, most were from the States and wanted at least to return to familiarity to sort this thing out. Buck nudged the businessman on his right. I'm sorry, friend, but you're going to want to be awake for this. The man peered at Buck with a disgusted look and slurred, if we're not crashing, don't bother me. Later, when Captain Rayford Steele was finally able to take a minute from flying tests, he used the satellite phone to dial an all news radio outlet and learned the far reaching effects of the disappearance of people from every continent. Communication lines were jammed. Medical, technical, and service people were among the missing all over the world. Every civil service agency was a full emergency status, trying to handle the unending tragedies. Rayford had covered terrorist attack and was minded how the hospitals and fire and police units be, brought everyone into work. He could imagine that now multiplied thousands of times. Even the newscasters' voices were terror filled, as much as they tried to mask it. Every conceivable explanation was proffered, but overshadowing all such discussion and even coverage of the carnage was the practical aspects. What people wanted from the news was simple information on how to get where they were going and how to contact their loved ones to determine if they were still around. Rayford was instructed to get in a multi-state traffic pattern that would allow him to land at O'Hare at a precise moment. Only two runways were open, and every large plane in the country seemed headed that way. Thousands were dead in plane crashes and car pileups. Emergency crews were trying to clear expressways and runways, all the while grieving over loved ones and co-workers who had disappeared. One report said that so many cabbies had disappeared from the cab corral at O'Hara that volunteers were being brought in to move the cars that had been left running with the former drivers' clothes still on the seats. Hi, oh my, good morning. Cars driven by people who spontaneously disappeared had careened out of control, of course. The toughest chore for emergency personnel was to determine who had disappeared, who was killed, and who was injured, and then to communicate that to the survivors. When Rayford was close enough to communicate to the tower at O'Hara, he asked if they would try to connect him by phone to his home. He was laughed off. Sorry, Captain, but phone lines are so jammed and phone personnel so spotty that the only hope is to get a dial tone and use a phone with a redial button. Oh, I love them too. We're on chapter 2 on the first book. So you can go back and get chapter 1 and this one if you want. Rayford filled the passengers in on the extent of the phenomenon and pleaded with them to remain calm. There is nothing we can do on this plane that will change the situation. My plan is to get you on the ground as quickly as possible in Chicago so you can have access to some answers and I hope some help. The in flight phone embedded in the back of the seat in front of Buck Williams was not assembled with external modular connections the way most phones were. Buck imagined that PanCon Airlines would soon be replacing these relics to avoid complaints from computer users. But Buck guessed that inside the phone the connection was standard and that if he could somehow get in there without damaging the phone, he could connect his computer's modem directly to the line. His own cell phone was not cooperating at this altitude. In front of him, Harold's wife rocked and whimpered, her face buried in her hands. The executive next to Buck snored, before drinking himself into oblivion soon after takeoff. He had said something about a major meeting in Scotland. Would he be surprised by the view upon landing? All around Buck, people cried, prayed, and talked. Flight attendants offered snacks and drinks, but few accepted. Having preferred an aisle seat for a little more leg room, Buck was now glad he was partially hidden near the window. He removed from his computer bag a tiny toolkit he had never expected to use and went to work on the phone. Disappointed to find no modular connection, even inside the housing, he decided to play amateur electrician. These phone lines always have the same color wires, he decided. So he opened his computer and cut the wire leading to the female connector. Inside the phone, he cut the wire and sliced off the protective rubber coating. Sure enough, the four inner wires from both computer and phone looked identical. In a few minutes, he had spliced them together. Buck tapped out a quick message to his executive editor, Steve Plank, in New York, telling of his destination. I will bang out all I know, and I'm sure this will be just one of my similar stories. But at least this will be up to the minute as it happens. Whether it will be of any use, I don't know. The thought hits me, Steve, that you may be among the missing. How would I know? You know my computer address. Let me know you're still with us. He stored the note and set up his modem to send it to New York in the background while he was working on his own writing. At the top of the screen, a status bar flashed every 20 seconds, informing him that the connection to his ramp on the information superhighway was busy. He kept working. The senior flight attendant startled him several pages into his own reflections and feelings. What in the world are you doing? She said, leaning in to stare at the mess of wires leading from his laptop to the in-flight phone. I can't let you do that. He glanced at her name tag. Listen, beautiful Hattie, are we or are we not looking at the end of the world as we know it? Don't patronize me, sir. I can't let you sit here and vandalize airline property. I'm not vandalizing it. I'm adapting it in an emergency. With this, I can hopefully make a connection where nothing else will work. I can't let you do it. Hattie, can I tell you something? Only that you're going to put that satellite phone back the way you found it. I will. Now. No, I won't do that. That's the only thing I want to hear. I understand that, but please listen. The man next to Buck stared at him and then at Hattie. He swore, then used a pillow to cover his right ear, pressing his left against the seat back. Hattie grabbed a computer printout from her pocket and located Buck's name. Mr. Williams, I expect you to cooperate. I don't want to bother the pilot with this. Buck reached for her hand. She stiffened but didn't pull away. Can we talk for just a second? Coffee. I'm not going to I'm not going to change my mind, sir. Now please, I have a plane full of frightened people. Aren't you one of them? He was still holding her hand. She pursed her lips and nodded. Wouldn't you like to make contact with someone? If this works, I can reach people who can make phone calls for you. Let your family know you're all right. Even get a message back to you. I haven't destroyed anything, and I promise I can put it back the way I found it. You can? I can. And you'd help me? Anything. Give me some names and phone numbers. I'll send them in with what I'm trying to upload to New York, and I'll insist that someone make the calls for you and report back to me. I can't guarantee I'll get through or that if I do, they'll get back to me, but I will try. I'd be grateful. And can you protect me from other overly jealous flight attendants? How do you manage to smile? They might all want your help. This is a long shot as it is. Just keep everybody away from me and let me keep trying. Deal, she said. But she looked troubled. Hattie, you're doing the right thing, he said. It's okay in a situation like this to think of yourself a little. That's what I'm doing. But everybody's in the same boat, sir, and I have responsibilities. You have to admit, when people disappear, some rules go out the window. Rayford still sat ashen-faced in the cockpit. Half an hour from touchdown in Chicago, he had told the passengers everything he knew. The simultaneous disappearance of millions all over the globe had resulted in chaos far beyond imagination. He complimented everyone on remaining calm and avoiding hysterics, although he had received reports of doctors on board who handed out Valium like candy. Rayford had been forthright, the only way he knew to be. He realized he had told the people more than he might have if he'd lost an engine, or his hydraulics, or even his landing gear. He had been frank with them that those who had not had loved ones disappear might get home to discover that they had been victims of the many tragedies that had ensued. He thought, but didn't say, how grateful he was to have been in the air when this event had taken place. What confusion must await them on the ground. Here, in a literal sense, they were above it all. They had been affected, of course. People were missing from everywhere. But except for the staff shortage caused by disappearance of 3 crew members, the passengers didn't suffer the way they might have had they been in the traffic or if he and Christopher had been among those who had disappeared. As he settled into a holding pattern miles from O'Hare, the full impact of the tragedy began to come into view. Flights from all over the country were being rerouted to Chicago. Planes were reorganized based on their fuel supplies. Rayford needed to stay in a priority position after flying across the eastern seaboard and then over the Atlantic before turning back. It was not Rayford's practice to communicate with ground control until after he landed, but now the air traffic control towers was recommending it. He was informed that visibility was excellent despite intermittent smoke from wreckages on the ground, but that landing would be risky and precarious because the 2 open runways were crowded with jets. They lined either side all the way down the runway. Every gate was full and none were backing out. Every mode of human transport was in use, busing passengers from the ends of the runways back to the terminal. But Rayford was told he would likely find that his people, at least most of them, would have to walk all the way. All remaining personnel had been called in to serve, but they were busy directing planes to safe areas. The few buses and vans were reserved for the handicapped, elderly, and flight crews. Rayford passed the word along that his crew would be walking. Passengers reported that they had been unable to get through, even on the in-flight satellite phones. Hattie Durham told Rayford that one enterprising passenger in first class had somehow hooked up the phone to his computer, and while he composed messages, it was automatically dialing and redialing New York. If a line opened, this would be the guy who got through. By the time the plane began its descent into Chicago, Buck had been able to squeeze onto only one briefly freed up connection to his computer service, which prompted him to download his waiting mail. This came just as Hattie announced that all electronic devices must be turned off. With an acumen he didn't realize he possessed, Buck speed tapped the keys that retrieved and filed all his messages, downloaded them, and backed him out of the link up in seconds. Just when his machine might have interfered with flight communications, he was offline and would have to wait to search his files for news from friends, coworkers, relatives, and anyone. Before her last-minute preparations for landing, Hattie hurried to Buck. Anything? He shook his head apologetically. Thanks for trying, she said, and she began to weep. He reached for her wrist. Hattie, we're all going to go home and cry today, but hang in there. Get your passengers off the plane, and you can at least feel good about that. Mr. Williams, she sobbed, you know, we lost several old people, but not all of them. And we lost several middle-aged people, but not all of them. And we lost several people your age and my age, but not all of them. We've even lost some teenagers. He stared at her. What was she driving at? Sir, we lost every child and baby on this plane. How many were there? More than a dozen. But all of them, not one was left. The man next to Buck roused and squinted at the late morning sun burning through the window. What in blazes are you two talking about? He said. We're about to land in Chicago, Hattie said. I've got to run. Chicago? You don't want to know, Buck said. The man nearly sat in Buck's lap to get a look out the window, his boozy breath enveloping Buck. What? Are we at war? Riots? What? Having just cut through the cloud bank, the plane allowed passengers a view of the Chicago area. Smoke, fire, cars off the road and smashed into each other and guardrails. Planes in pieces on the ground, emergency vehicles, lights flashing, picking their way around the debris. As O'Hare came into view, it was clear no one was going anywhere soon. There were planes as far as the eye could see. Some There were planes as far as the eye could see, some crashed and burning, the others gridlocked in line. People trudged through the grass and between the vehicles toward the terminal. The expressways that led to the airport looked like they had during the great Chicago blizzards, only without the snow. Cranes and wreckers were trying to clear a path through the front of the terminal so cars could get in and out, but that would take hours, if not days. A snake of humanity wended its way slowly out of the great terminal buildings between the motionless cars and onto the ramps. People walking, 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 looking for a cab or a limo. Buck began plotting how he would beat the new system. Somehow he had to get moving and get out of such a congested area. The problem was his goal was to get to a worse one, New York. Ladies and gentlemen, Ray announced, I want to thank you again for your cooperation today. We've been asked to put down on the only runway that will take this size plane and then to taxi to an open area about 2 miles from the terminal. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to use our inflatable emergency chutes because we will not be able to hook up to any gateways. If you are unable to walk to the terminal, please stay with the plane and we will send someone back for you. There was no thanking them for choosing Pan Continental. No, we hope you'll make us your choice next time you need air service. He did remind them to stay seated with their belts fastened until he turned off the seatbelt sign. Because privately he knew this would be his most difficult landing in years. He knew he could do it, but it had been a long time since he had had to land a plane among other aircraft. Rayford envied whoever it was in first class who had the inside track on communicating by modem. He was desperate to call Irene, Chloe, and Ray Jr. On the other hand, he feared he might never talk to them again. And that is chapter 2. And next time, we'll do chapter 3. So thank you for joining, and I hope you enjoyed it. And you're free to go. Bye.